Greetings, sisters and brothers, and welcome again to Tyke Productions. I'm your host, Talib Muhammad, and I thank you for coming back to our channel. The African continent is indisputably the most abundantly rich landmass on Earth. The vastness of its resources has led to the very foundation for economic systems throughout the world. For centuries and millenniums, such natural treasures has resulted in outside forces aggressively seeking to exploit the riches of the continent for the edification of other nations and peoples. In today's presentation, we'd like to explore some of the history as to what took place on the African continent in regards to its infiltration, subjugation, colonization, and exploitation in what would come to be known as the Scramble for Africa, of how the greed and depraved inhumanity of destructive invaders sliced up the continent at the Berlin Conference and forced the continent's people into a state of economic turmoil and poverty, the residual effects of which still remain even until today. So, sisters and brothers, we've got 600 years to cover, so let's get to work here on Each One Teach Two. In today's world, we observe a gross imbalance of wealth and power. Collectively, nations from Europe and the Western Hemisphere possess and or control the primary bulk of the global economy and military power. Although China has, in recent years, entered that arena of economic prosperity and military might, it as a nation still pales in comparison to the combined riches of the European/American nations. When considering the fact that the continent of Africa possesses more natural resources than any other, the question that should be raised is how did outside forces obtain control of these African resources? What is the history behind the overthrowing of the Africans and their control of their own fate, and what plunged the continent into its current state of financial difficulties? As with most similar inquiries, we must examine some of the history of the continent in order to best comprehend the present day situation. Now, African history can be traced back for tens of thousands of years. As the literal birthplace of humankind, the continent's past is inundated with some of the most miraculous civilizations the world has ever known, including that of Timbuktu, Egypt, Mali, Axum, Kush, Carthage, Punt, and many others. Over the course of thousands of years, the continent has been invaded by numerous nations, including those from Asia and Europe, as well as from nations who are located in what is now identified as the Middle East. Each incursion resulted in the gradual erosion of the African nation's sovereignty and historical cultural footprint. It would eventually be the invaders from Europe who would initiate the modern day concept of colonialism on the African continent, with the Portuguese leading the way. In the early 1400s, the son of the King of Portugal set out to find the source of the abundance of gold that existed along the western coast of Africa, as well as to initiate control of the early West African slave trade. This man was Prince Henry the Navigator. And once becoming aware of the great wealth that was found along the African western coastline, Henry was commissioned by his father, King John I, to establish trade with the native Africans. As would be the case with every European encounter of any indigenous people on any continent in the entire world, the eventual goal was to subjugate the inhabitants of those nations and subsequently seize the riches of the lands therein. Such greed and a lust for power served as the primary motivation for Henry's explorations. As a very accomplished seaman, he mastered the trade winds that were known as easterlies in this area of the Atlantic Ocean, and he took advantage of those easterlies to initiate the transportation of enslaved Africans into Europe. By the mid-1400s, the Portuguese had secured a commanding position in the West African gold trade, as well as natural resources such as ivory, spices, and of course, enslaved Africans. Over the next 200 plus years since Henry's explorations, only the Spanish and Dutch would colonize African nations until Sweden arrived in 1650. By the close of the century, the British, French, Dutch, and Prussians had also come to Africa, each bringing with them a similar mentality of greed, exploitation, and subjugation. The desire to expand their respective empires, as well as partake in the highly lucrative African slave trade, served as early incentive for these invaders. And in these early explorations, European activities were originally limited to the coastal area of the continent, having established treaties with native people and opening numerous trading posts along the western coast. It would be nearly 2 more centuries before these plunderers realized the enormous riches that Africa possessed further inland, thus motivating them to incorporate the seizing of the continent's natural resources and incorporate into their plan of taking control of Africa as a whole. A major obstacle to a more aggressive assault into taking control of Africa was the continuous military conflicts throughout the European continent itself. During the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, Europeans were preoccupied with constant wars between each other. And there was virtually no period of time when one European nation was not at war with another European nation. And this continued for several centuries. The prospect of exploring a faraway and mysterious continent such as Africa was much too costly and time consuming for the monarchs of Europe to finance or even show interest in, considering they were at war. Over the future decades, these early invading nations expanded upon their African holdings, specifically France in the north and west and England in the south. However, the difficulties of navigating the uncharted terrain of inner Africa, battling diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, and the enormous expenses of instituting and maintaining colonization on the continent temporarily deterred other European nations from committing to a structured invasion of the African continent. Gradually, as the generation of Europeans inhabiting the continent became more familiar with the abundance of riches that Africa possessed, other nations began to take interest in what they had entitled the Dark Continent. Now, this definition was applied to Africa not so much in regards to the complexion of the indigenous people therein, but instead as a term to indicate the Europeans' collective ignorance of the continent as a whole. It would not be until 1876, more than 400 years after Henry's initial voyages, that Leopold II, Belgium's constitutional monarch, invited an assembly of geographical experts and philanthropists to Brussels for what he called the Belgium Geographical Conference. It would be at this meeting that the International African Association would be founded. Please note that no African people were a part of the International African Association. Leopold would present to his fellow Europeans a proposal for Belgium to establish a humanitarian charitable program for the benefit of the native people of the Congo region of Central Africa, and he would discontinue this institutionalized slavery. Additionally, Belgium would bring civilization to the Africans and spread Christianity among them as well. Leopold was able to deceive the far more powerful nations of Europe, who did not view Belgium as a threat to them, as Belgium was a very small country that held no significant lands outside of its own boundaries. Whereas Leopold's cousin, Queen Victoria of England, had secured many lands around the world and was still expanding the kingdom, Leopold sought to attain an empire of his own to compete with the conquering successes of his cousin Victoria. In 1879, Leopold commissioned the renowned explorer Henry Morgan Stanley to explore and navigate the area known as the Congo. For the next 6 years, Stanley would familiarize himself with all the intricacies of the Congo and Central Africa as a whole, set up treaties with the natives, and navigate enchanted terrain. Upon becoming aware of Belgium's progress in the continent, the French and Portuguese initiated their own expanded exploration program to counter Belgium's strategies. Portugal would align with England in an attempt to offset Belgium's efforts to control the waterways and trade routes that led from Central Africa to the Atlantic Ocean. France would dispatch Pierre de Brazza, an Italian-born but French-educated naval officer, to the Congo to secure lands for the French, and he actually accomplished his goal ahead of Stanley. Today's capital of Congo is named after de Brazza. France would then persuade Italy and Germany to unite with it in the French's attempt to gain control of the Congo. This coalition posed a threat to the aspirations of the English and the Portuguese, and the tensions on the continent quickly amplified. It would be these geopolitical ambitions, along with their collective greed and thirst for power, that led these parasitic Europeans on a collision course toward inevitable military conflict amongst themselves, reminiscent of the centuries of wars that had taken place on the European continent previously. Realizing the necessity to establish a structured system of coexistence, Leopold was instrumental in persuading his European colleagues to form an amalgamation of these nations that had African aspirations and institute a peaceful land and trade agreement. Consequently, in 1884, Otto von Bismarck, a previous Prussian prime minister who was now the first chancellor of Germany, was commissioned to oversee this alliance of European nations. He quickly organized a meeting of 14 countries in the city of Berlin, Germany, in what would come to be called the Berlin Conference. Bismarck, who was often referred to as the Iron Chancellor, was a highly accomplished politician and warmonger who had orchestrated and manipulated several conflicts throughout Europe and established Germany as a formidable European nation. He was initially opposed to the concept of colonialism in Africa, as his position was that colonies were too costly to maintain and secure. However, after being persuaded by various European influencers and with the prospect of securing valuable lands on the African continent for Germany, Bismarck reversed his position and administered this illicit partnership in what would come to be known as the Scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference was initiated on April 15, 1884, and concluded on April 26, 1885. The nations that attended the conference included Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, England, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, Turkey, and the United States of America, who served as the only non-European nation to attend. No representatives from any African nation was permitted to be represented at the Scramble for Africa. Imagine, if you will, the orchestration of this diabolical scheme to systematically invade the African continent, seize control of its resources, and subjugate the native people therein. I liken it to a scene from the movie The Godfather, where the heads of the 5 crime families meet to resolve their differences, discontinue violence amongst themselves, and establish the guidelines for their future drug trafficking ambitions. Politicians and law enforcement would be bribed, adversaries would be murdered, and all organized crime families would benefit from this agreement. The Berlin Conference worked in much the same way. As trade and water routes were established, mining and agricultural arrangements were made, and geographical borders were drawn. Local leaders were bribed or murdered. Agreements were made to discontinue all aggressions against each other, and all forms of African autonomy and self-governance was eliminated and replaced with an exploitive form of apartheid, ethnocide, and eventually genocide. Each European nation's plan in regards to taking control of the African continent involved both deceptive negotiations and horrific violence toward these indigenous peoples. When the conference ended, Africa had been divided up by these plunderers, and colonies were established on the continent, thus instituting a new form of colonization. Only the countries of Ethiopia and Liberia avoided this colonization, with the United States being the only nation from the conference that did not found a colony. The Europeans involved in this criminal syndicate justified their inhumane scheme against the African people by fabricating a delusional reality wherein they declared themselves to be members of a superior race, and that it was their duty to civilize the inferior races who occupied the African continent. This imbecilic fallacy of white supremacy would be promoted by many throughout Europe's political and academic arenas, with even the most liberal-minded Caucasian turning a blind eye to the brutality, racism, and oppression instituted by these bigoted plunderers. Perhaps the most diabolic of all of these invaded nations was none other than Leopold II himself. Remember him? With his powers in Belgium limited to his status as constitutional monarch, Leopold sought to establish a kingdom wherein he could be absolute monarch. He cunningly deceived his colleagues at the Berlin Conference by depicting his ambitions in Africa as being those with benevolent objectives. He convinced them that should he be permitted to take complete control of the Congo, he would institute a humanitarian enterprise focusing on civilizing the Africans, terminating slavery, establishing free trade, and amplifying efforts to spread Christianity to the Congolese people. He would also ensure that under his control, the waterways and resources of the land would be utilized to guarantee an economic windfall for all involved. The other colonizing nations did not view the aspiration of tiny Belgium as being a threat to their own greedy ambitions, and having represented himself as a philanthropist and humanitarian whose objective was to free and Christianize the Congolese people while maintaining a peaceful occupation of the land, a collective agreement was made and Leopold's proposal was approved. Through treachery and deceptive manipulation, Leopold has succeeded at his quest of expanding Belgium's empire, as the Congo was 8 times the size of Belgium's mainland. And with the support of his fellow invaders, Leopold would become the sole owner of the Congo, declaring the country his personal property. He would entitle his new possession the Congo Free State, a name that was as duplicitous as Leopold himself. Despite this benevolent, libertarian-sounding name, Leopold's true intentions had absolutely nothing to do with the freedom, humanitarianism, or Christian values, but instead involved some of the most brutal and merciless evils the world has ever known. During this occupation, the Congolese people suffered greatly under the cruel oppressions and exploitations of the Belgians. This included forced labor in harvesting rubber, palm oil, ivory, and other resources. Refusal or failure to meet the required quotas of these resources resulted in imprisonment, severe beatings, and torture. One of the most common forms of punishment was the amputations of the hands of countless Congolese men, women, and even children. Leopold's level of human carnage is historically noted for its systemic brutality that also involved kidnapping, torture, rape, and murder. So horrific was Leopold's transgressions in the Congo that other European nations, despite their own aggressions and brutality against the people of Africa and every nation they invaded, took exception to Leopold's level of violence and inhumanity. This systemic brutality would continue until George Washington Williams ventured to the Congo to interview Leopold in 1889. The multi-talented Williams was a journalist, lawyer, politician, and Baptist minister. Upon meeting Leopold, Williams was initially impressed with his dialogue in regards to the so-called plans for the Congolese people and the Congo Free State. However, upon actually traveling through the Congo countryside, he personally witnessed the horrors perpetrated by the Belgians against the Congolese people, including torture, amputations, forced labor, and widespread famine. Williams would document and publish all of his findings, thus exposing Leopold for his involvement in the terrible violence committed against the Congolese. In a letter to Leopold, Williams specified the horrors that he had witnessed in the Congo and used for the first time in history the term crimes against humanity. Once the letters became public, it initiated an international outcry against the contemptible actions of Leopold's forces in the Congo. Williams' revelations resulted in an inquiry that led to the British journalist and pacifist E.D. Morel to become involved and further expose these crimes. He would be joined by an Irish diplomat and humanitarian named Roger Casement in addressing the issue in the Congo. Their collaboration resulted in the Casement Report that would further detail the carnage committed by Leopold's regime in the Congo, and details of the horrors were spread throughout the world. Upon being internationally exposed for the level of inhumanity being conducted against the African people in the Congo, the Belgian parliament forced Leopold to abandon the Congo Free State, and it would be renamed the Belgian Congo, thus establishing it as a typical European colony. In an effort to conceal the evidences of his horrific crimes against humanity, Leopold ordered the burning of all documentations and accounts of his horrific actions while in the Congo. Despite being the orchestrator of some of the most violent and destructive actions in history, Leopold was never held responsible for any of his crimes. As was the same that can be said for many of the Europeans, if not all of the Europeans, who committed atrocities on the continent similar to those of Leopold. This intervention by the Belgian parliament was by no means a liberation of the Congolese people, as the conditions in the region, as was the case of all invaded nations of Africa, only marginally improved, and the exploitation and subjugation continued, with greed continued to be the motivating factor for this occupation and systemic oppression. Whereas Leopold's viciousness in the Congo may have been the most appalling example of European colonialism in Africa, please do not consider the other invading nations to be absolved from committing horrific crimes against the African people as well. Each nation oppressed, exploited, and dehumanized the natives of the continent for many decades, continuously draining Africa of its cash crop, its natural resources, and disenfranchising its people. The tyrannical system of colonialism would continue until just after World War II, when the Pan-African Congress demanded the termination of colonial rule in Africa. By the time colonialism had begun to wane in Africa, tens of millions of indigenous people had died as a result of the European aggressions on the continent, with 10 to 20 million of them losing their lives in the process. Throughout the following 2 decades, African nations were able to initiate their independence, due in part to the efforts of many great African leaders and influencers. However, this independence was not a complete reversal of the tyranny the Europeans had inflicted upon the African people, as through cunning manipulations and espionage and continued lack of basic humanity, European leaders replaced their military presence on the continent with that economic stranglehold on the economy of each African nation. Basically, the military / political gangsters were placed with a collection of banksters. Having raped the land of its wealth for centuries and plunged so much of the continent into a state of poverty, these banksters, by way of monetary cartels such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, offered very slyly crafted loans to the newly founded independent nations of Africa. This resulted in a continuous controlling of the people of the continent, this time by way of their economy. Sisters and brothers, in the last 50 years, progress has been made in several African nations, while others continue to struggle with the after effects of brutal exploitive colonialism. Perhaps in the future, we at Type Productions shall make a video on the decolonization efforts of the African continent. Well, sisters and brothers, as always, we at Type Productions would like to thank you for taking the time to view our presentation. And we hope that it provided you with some information that may be of some value to you or to someone you love. In closing, I leave you with this. The European concept of colonization spread throughout Africa like a cancer. It attempted to rape this magnificent continent of its natural resources and dehumanize its people, both of which failed. And now, as has been the case in the past, the descendants of these Europeans are once again at war with one another. Only posterity will determine the final outcome of these events. We thank you again, sisters and brothers, and may peace be upon you and all of yours.
Muslims have sometimes, whether you have or not, and I think probably you have sometimes, it seemed to me, been preaching hate to meet hate.
I don't advocate any kind of hate.
But there's a lot of talk that sounds very much like it.
No, I think that the guilt complex of the American white man is so profound until when you begin to analyze the real condition of the black man in America, instead of the American white man eliminating the causes that create that condition, he tries to cover it up by accusing his accusers of teaching hate. But actually, they're just exposing him for being responsible for what exists.